So now I'd like to present our speaker today, Professor Bill Burnett. So Bill is an adjunct professor of mechanical engineering and the executive director of the design program at Stanford. He directs the undergraduate and graduate program in the design and teaches at the D School. He received his Bachelor's of Science and Master's of Science in Product Design at Stanford and has worked in startups and Fortune 500 companies, including 7 years at Apple, designing award-winning laptops, and a number of years in the toy industry, designing Star Wars action figures. He holds a number of mechanical and design patents and design awards. And in addition to his duties at Stanford, he's on the board of Voss, a socially responsible fashion startup, and advises several other startups companies. So with that, Bill, I'd like to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. We'll just get started here. And we try to create a little bit of a provocative title, Meet Finding an Empty, Why Your Customers Can't Tell You What They Want. And from the looks of the number of participants we have here, I guess the title worked. But it's really an interesting conversation. And I have this conversation a lot with people when they either are reading about design thinking or they've maybe been to one of our workshops, the master class, which is coming up in June, or one of the other workshops we do. And they go, well, wait a minute, this design thinking thing, it's kind of pretty simple, isn't it? You just go out and ask customers what they want, and then you build it, and then they say that's it, and then you're done, right? And it really doesn't work that way. So to take a little bit of a step back to just make sure everybody's on the same page, design thinking is both a process and what we call a set of mindsets, a way of thinking or a culture that you create in your organizations. And this is the pretty common diagram. You see this all over the D School website and our website and the design program. It's this notion that it's a kind of a 5-step process. You start with empathy, and you define or redefine the problem. Ideate just means have lots and lots of ideas, and then you prototype and test. Now, the thing about this diagram that's a little bit misleading is it looks like it's a pretty linear process, but in fact, it's not that at all. What happens is people design teams enter this process at various points. Maybe they have an idea already that they want to try with customers. Maybe they don't even know what their customers, who their customers are going to be if they're a brand new startup. But this is sort of the way we describe it. And the way I've always talked about these kinds of process diagrams is, remember, the diagram isn't the process. It's just a way of breaking it down so we can teach it. I like to use an analogy to golf. If I were going to try to teach you if I was going to try to learn to play golf, I couldn't teach anyone because I'm a terrible golfer. But if I was going to learn to play golf, a teacher would probably break the golf swing down into a number of things, like how do I hold the club? What's the proper grip? How do you address the ball? How do you place the ball on the tee? How do you bring the club back? So each of these pieces would be described as a separate step. But of course, that's not what a golf swing is. A golf swing is a continuous, a beautiful continuous motion that results in the golf ball going where you want it to go. So remember that the process diagram is not the way the process actually unfolds when you do it. That's one of the reasons we like to talk about the mindsets of design thinking. The way in which designers think, and the way in which, if you have a culture of creativity, your design team or your company would think. I always say you start with curiosity. We're trained as engineers, designers, people, if you're in marketing, finance, whatever the discipline you are in an organization, you're trained to think about the world sort of with a skeptical rationalism. You break problems down into, smaller and smaller steps. You rationalize them. You use your logic and your deductive reasoning to make decisions. But that's not a particularly useful way to think about doing innovation, because when you're doing innovation, you're moving into a future where nothing exists yet, where the things that you're trying to invent haven't been invented. And so there really isn't much to be skeptical or rational about. It's much more interesting and much more generative to be curious. So we start with curiosity, and then we typically reframe the problem. That block called define, I always call redefine, because typically we've been given the wrong problem to solve. A lot of problems are sort of, out there in the world, but the real problem is something kind of either a deeper or at a more abstract level. We like radical collaboration across multiple teams. We like to be mindful of our process, because when you're in the middle of a converging part of the process where we're trying to bring things together, it's important to know that's not a good time for brainstorming. When you're in a divergent part of the process where you're looking for lots more ideas, that's when you want to reach out, collaborate, and brainstorm more. And then, of course, we have a bias to action because of this sort of problem we're going to talk about next, about why people can't tell you what they want. Since there's not a lot of data to be analyzed and there's not much that we can plan with, we just like to start by doing. So with that as sort of a background, I always say, with design thinking, we always say that we start with the people, not the problem. I've been a consultant for, 25, 30 years. Because someone might come in and say, hey, we're a company and we make these certain products and we'd like to make new, more innovative versions of these products. And that's typically the wrong place to start. We go back out and say, well, that's interesting. Let's just start with who your users are, who your customers are, and go there. Because most problems are actually solutions masquerading as a problem. The new wheelbarrow project is the classic example. I was doing a project for a company that makes wheelbarrows. Actually, it's a slightly disguised project. They made another really, really common industrial product that you'll find on every job site. But we're going to say they made wheelbarrows. And they wanted us to do an innovative wheelbarrow. And so the problem, of course, with that framing of the problem is that the problem already is described as a solution. They want another wheelbarrow. They just want an innovative one. That might result in some, small product modifications. 2 wheels instead of 1, better handles, more ergonomic, design of the lifting process so that people don't hurt themselves. But at the end of the day, you're still going to end up with a slightly modified wheelbarrow. And so that's an example where the solution is not actually what the problem is. The problem that a wheelbarrow solves, if you step back a second, is that, there's workers all over a job site, and materials are typically delivered to the job site around the periphery because it's easier for trucks to drop things off in pallets full of, let's say, bricks, at the periphery of the job site. And therefore, you can't get the bricklayers are over somewhere else, and so they come with their wheelbarrows. They unload a few bricks into the wheelbarrow, and they walk over to where they are doing the work. So the problem isn't wheelbarrows. The problem is the dislocation of workers and supplies. Once you've framed the problem that way, there's lots and lots of ways you can solve it that are much more innovative than simply thinking about a new wheelbarrow. To give you one example, you could, instead of delivering all the bricks on pallets to the edge of the job site, you could have Amazon deliver the bricks in individual small quantities with their army of drones, in which case locating each of the bricklayers by the cell phone coordinates in their pocket, their GPS receivers in their cell phones would simply transmit their location on site, and the drone would put the bricks exactly where they want them. You would never come to a solution like that, and I'm not necessarily saying that's a good solution, but you never come to a solution that had that much innovation in it if you were just brainstorming wheelbarrows. So this old notion that you just pick a group of users and ask them what they want, what they need, it just doesn't work. And here's the reason why. This is a famous Henry Ford quote, right? That he said, if I'd asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. Now, just as a disclaimer here, I want to point out that it's most likely that Henry Ford never said that. We can't find any historical evidence of it. But it's sort of a snarky statement. It's something Henry might have said. But his point was simply that, users don't know what they want. They only know what they've got. And so when you ask them about what they need, they give you variations of the things that they already know about. And that's the first part of the problem. The problem with this need-finding thing is you go out and let's say you were I was at Apple for 7 years, but long before they started doing phones. But I know some people from the original phone team. And they knew they were going to do a phone. That wasn't what the need-finding was about. The need-finding was all about what kind of a phone, what would the features be, how would data be presented, what would be the sort of model of the new paradigm. So let's say you're on a team like that, and you've done a bunch of market research and a bunch of ethnography, and you've determined that users have a specific set of needs, that needs to find their phone numbers easily, needs to be able to navigate to website easily, things like that. So you build this really high-resolution prototype, which most people call a beta, or beta prototype, that objectively you and your team knows you have met all the needs that the users have talked about. You show it to your customer, expecting that they will love it. And what they say is the thing that all engineers and designers hate. They say, oh, yeah, that's what I said I wanted. But now that I see that, I've changed my mind. You know what I really want? And isn't that maddening, right? And this is where the engineers go back to the marketing people and say, hey, you didn't spec this right because we showed it to users and they had other needs that you never told us about. And the marketing guys say, well, wait a minute, we told you to build exactly what they wanted, so if they didn't like it, you must not have built what they wanted. But instead of getting into that conversation, you just got to acknowledge that humans are what is called technically a wicked problem. Human beings do not stand still inside some sort of market research bubble, and their needs and their wants are not consistent from moment to moment, and particularly when you've shown them something that they never could have imagined. And here's the problem. Here's a wicked problem. Wicked problem is something that came out of social science, and I think originally out of Berkeley, some guys who were studying urban planning and why, even though when you build something everybody wants, they don't like it anymore. They said a wicked problem is a problem that's difficult or impossible to solve because of incomplete, contradictory, and changing requirements. In addition to that, these requirements are often difficult to recognize. It's difficult to understand if you really understood the requirements of users because users are so complex. And this is why. The data that you're looking for, the data that you want, is about some future state. But that future state changes as soon as you propose a solution. So I want a phone that makes it easy for me to find my phone numbers. You show me a phone with a graphical user interface. And then I say, well, wow, if I had a graphical user interface, I want a browser too. And that was never in the spec. But you've shown me something that changes my perception of what's possible. Because I only, as a user, only believe, that you could maybe find a better way to do menus to solve my problem of finding my phone numbers in my address book. But then later you show me this other thing, and I realize, oh, now if that's possible, then all these other things are possible, and now I've changed what I want. And the users don't often, this notion that the requirements are difficult to recognize, the users don't often recognize their own needs, or what we call latent or non-obvious needs, because of what we call the expert problem, or what social scientists call the expert problem. When you give a person a piece of technology, or if you remember the first time you used a spreadsheet, or the first time you used a browser, and maybe the user interface was clumsy or difficult on the very first piece of software you tried, you knew it was valuable to learn this, so you worked really hard to learn it, and you figured out all these little tricks. If you remember Lotus 1, 2, 3, or the early days of Excel, it was hard to figure out how to do things. So you figured out all these little tricks, and you became, quote, an expert. You were the person in the office who knew how to use that piece of hard software. And so even though there were things in the software that were difficult to use, and this applies to physical products or any other kind of product, where, there's a little bit of difficulty to overcome, and you become the expert, you've overcome the difficulty, you know the workarounds. Then when I ask you, what do you need? You say, nothing. This works really well. And I have to observe how you're using it in order to understand all the ways in which you've worked around difficulties that are not obvious to you anymore because you've become an expert. Dave Liddell, who was one of the founders of interval research here in Silicon Valley, talked about this problem in a couple of papers he wrote. And he was also at the early Xerox PARC work on the Star microcomputers, which became the Apple's Macintosh interface. He talked about how software goes through sort of three phases. First, only experts and gurus can use it. This is, IBM mainframes in an air-conditioned room and technicians in white coats. And then it becomes technical software that's used by a large group of people, but the technical nature of the software requires developing expertise, and then the experts hoard that knowledge and actually can't tell you that about the workarounds that they've invented. Finally, software becomes easy to use in consumer software. So think of video games, think of Nintendo and things like that. And now all of the websites that you use, whose user interfaces are simple and easy, with a flick of a finger or a thumb, you navigate through them. And so now you're not expecting to have expert knowledge. just expecting to be able to use the product because it's so easy. But we've entered the era of, expectations where everyone believes that the product should be easy to use, and yet the design of products is still mired in this old idea of trying to capture the user requirements, writing a document, and then executing on it, when, in fact, pedagogically, you cannot discover the true nature of the user's need by simply interviewing and observing. You have to do the rest of the process, which is to provoke the user's experience with a prototype, super low resolution if possible, in order to, kind of churn up this next layer of information. The thing that when they say, oh, well, if that's possible, then you know what I really want is, and that's how you get to the non-obvious user needs. That's the most important thing to understand, I think, about need finding and empathy, is that it works on this class of nonlinear, human-centered, wicked problems. So going back to basics of understanding of how we know anything, I'm going to propose there's kind of three kinds of thinking. Engineering thinking, that bridge in the picture here, is very straightforward. If I know the length of the bridge, the strength of the steel beams I'm going to use, and I know how many cars, what the load on that bridge will be, and what the loads from wind and other things will be, I have a completely bounded set of information, and I have the equations that allow me to solve for the strength of the bridge, the length of the bridge, and its structural elements. And moreover, if I take that same set of specifications, same distance, the same loads, but I move it from, San Francisco to New York, the same bridge will work in both cases because the boundary conditions of the systems are exactly the same. So what we say with engineering thinking, you can solve your way forward because you have a bounded system. Now, in scientific thinking, it's a little different. We have a hypothesis, and this is how we've moved, all knowledge forward. We have a hypothesis, and then we create an experiment which carefully isolates the variables so that we can determine whether it's independent or dependent on other variables. Then we run the experiment, create a data set, and we analyze the data, and we either decide the hypothesis is true or false. The two things that are critical in this is that we can design a good experiment, we can isolate the variable we wish to test, and that we keep our hypothesis constant. We can't change the hypothesis to match the data. That would get us thrown out of any scientific journal because that would be cheating. The hypothesis has to stand alone. And so in scientific thinking, we analyze our way forward. Now, we don't have all the data in science, right? We're inventing new data, but we have this very rigorous process of testing hypothesis through experiments that allow us to validate the true or falseness of data. And we believe in science at Stanford. I hope most of our audience does as well. Then you get to this other class of problems we've just been talking about, where you have humans in the equation and the data set is not confined, it's not well bounded. Humans come at problems from a variety of different cultural, social, and economic biases. They look at products and services based on the ones they've already experienced. They are very poor at projecting forward into technologies that they don't know about or possible solutions to the problem that employ techniques that they're unfamiliar with. And they have this problem changing, quality to them where once provoked with a possible solution about something in the future, their needs change. So they're co-creating their needs with examples that you show them. Only way we know to solve that problem, and the most powerful way to solve that problem, which is actually, we've been working on for almost 50 years here. We started giving degrees in this in our design program at Stanford in 1963. The D School is just a little over 10 years old now. We started in 2006. When that was where we started teaching design thinking to everybody. But we've really been working on this stuff for a long time, and what we've discovered through many, many iterations of the process is that the only way to discover the non-obvious latent needs, that nuanced data set that is so valuable to innovation, is to build our way forward, to build and try the process over and over again, to eventually collapse the user's experience down to something that they all agree is valuable at least for that moment. That picture up, by the way, the picture I have of the iPhone in the last couple slides ago was the original iPhone. And it's kind of funny to look at it now. It looks so old-fashioned. It only has a few icons on the screen. It's tiny. It's got little round edges. It's interesting how not only do our needs change, but our sense of style and values change, and particularly in technology products that evolve so quickly. It's funny to see something that's not even 10 years old look so old-fashioned. So I'm going to go through a build here of what we call the 5 basic skills around design thinking. And this is, so we've discovered why customers can't tell you what they need because they actually don't know it, and because it evolves with the experimentation that you do with prototypes. So now how do we actually get there? What's the process that gets us this innovation data that we desperately need if we want to have products that are radically different than things we've ever done before and open up new value propositions, new markets, and or create in the nonprofit world, new services that scale very rapidly. So we say there are 5 basic skill sets that underlie this whole process. And you put them all together and you use them in an iterative process, and it turns out to be the only way we know to sort of invent and innovate regularly in the future. So the first step we talked about, observing with empathy, and we call it seeing the water. Fish, there's an old joke, 2 fish are swimming along, 2 young fish are swimming along, and an older fish swims by in the other direction, and as he goes by, he says, "Hey boys, how's the water?" And the other 2 little fish swim on for a while, and then one turns to the other and he says, "What the hell is water?" And that's a little joke, but it's all about, we don't see the environment we live in. We don't understand. We don't often, make visible or make actionable the culture we live in. And so this observing with empathy is about seeing the water that your users swim in, this expert problem where they don't even notice the workarounds they're doing anymore because they've gotten so good at that piece of software or so good at that interaction. So you have to break it down and you have to see the water, which is, all involved with observation and this process of provoking the world with prototypes. You go out, you talk to people, you show them stuff, you look at the world they're in, you live with them, you do a ride-along for a day with a cop, or you do a, in-home visit with an elderly person if you're working on an aging-in-place project. And you really try to get, into their shoes. We call it a moccasin walk. You walk a bit in their shoes. But from that you have all this data, and now you have to develop insights. Because the idea after empathy of define is creating a point of view, which is a little different than a hypothesis because we're allowed to change it as we get new data. It's more flexible than a hypothesis. But the insights come from framing and reframing the data and trying to understand what people actually are thinking and feeling behind their actions. Third skill set, the ability to manage ideas and the flow of ideas. We talk about a certain process being divergent. And actually, when you form a multidisciplinary team or a radical collaboration team, you want to have some people who, and there's a couple of tests for this, but you kind of know it in the people that you work with. You want to find some people who are just really good at divergent thinking. In other words, they're just really good at having lots and lots of crazy ideas, and they're not very good at figuring out which ones are the good ones or the bad ones, but they love the process of diverging and opening up the solution space. And anyone can learn this if you learn to brainstorm well, you learn mind mapping, you learn morphological analysis, you learn some of our improvisation techniques, all of which are just about diverging and opening up the solution space. But you also want to be good at converging. Well, now we've got lots of good solutions to choose from. What does our intuition tell us are the best ones to choose to start narrowing down? So this converging and diverging and being cognizant of when you do one or the other is really one of the critical things. Actually, one of the hardest things to teach is this the sort of layer of insight that happens here about there's lots of different ideas we might pursue, but these ones over here feel like they might be more interesting or in a more generative direction or might yield potentially some more innovative solutions downstream. The thing most teams do is they try to, once they have lots of ideas, they pick something that they know how to do or they pick something that's familiar to them. And that's typically the wrong solution or the wrong solution set to pick because you'll end up kind of back where you started. So this diverging and converging process, very important to manage. And this I love, in this deck we call it iterative failure, or just failing. There are a whole bunch of different ways of thinking about it. David Kelly, our senior professor and the founder of the Z School and the founder of IDEO, says you got to fail early if you want to succeed sooner. You know, fail early, fail fast to succeed sooner. We also talk about failing forward. And this is the notion of prototyping. And very specifically, prototypes in this case are really low resolution sort of attempts to interrogate the customers and find out more about their needs, because you know the needs will change once they see the prototypes. So it's not about projects failing. Although I think if you're going to be in an organization that wants to support innovation, you have to reframe even project failure as learning. And you have to be willing to fail a little bit, even at the project level, if you want to be an innovative organization. But mostly when we talk about failing fast to learn something, we're talking about prototyping and building our way forward into the environment such that we have things that we can talk about and we can provoke users and we can observe new behaviors. And it's never a failure if the user uses the prototype in a way that was unintended or doesn't use the prototype at all but suggests an alternative path. That is a huge success, even though you might argue that the prototype failed. So, you know, after cycling through your observation phase and your framing phase and figuring out, you know, converging and diverging, and then coming down to a few sets of solutions that you prototype, you know, you have to accept that you're going to fail forward. And then as you begin to recognize certain patterns are persistent, that users react the same way positively to certain things, and you start building on those things and making those things even more evident in your prototypes, you get to the place where you go from sort of interrogating users to sort of selling them on your idea. This idea that David Kelly talks about of, you know, nowadays it's no longer good enough for the design team to just say, here's our design, what do you think? You have to take the design and put it inside a story where it's the story of the future of a user named John, who wants to do something new and different. And here's my product enabling John's life in a new and different way. And if I tell the story of John with my product in the future, making John's life better, I've created the momentum around the design that will drive it through even skeptical organizations, because now I have proof of an example of a person using the product in the future. And storytelling has become such an important part of design now that we have a whole class on it. So those, you know, I guess 5 basic skills: observing with empathy, developing insights and asking why, the ability to diverge and generate lots of ideas, but then converge and pick the ones that are the most likely to lead to innovation, not the ones you're the most comfortable with. Then moving through the process by building your way forward, building and failing, building and failing, building and succeeding a little, building and finding a resonant point of view where everybody is converging on something that's new and interesting. I don't know the history of the case study of Tinder, the app, but somebody figured out that, you know, matching people through profiles, you know, in a match-to-match way was probably a good idea. But the real kind of innovation was this gesture of, you know, swiping right, swiping left, which is partly driven by the technology and the interface of the smartphone, but it's also recognizing the sort of casual nature of moving the data in and out of your stream of consciousness in a way that matched the way people were imagining this dating matching process going. And I think that deep resonance is what caused, you know, Tinder to be the app that everybody uses and all the other ones to fail. Taking all the friction out of an interface is one thing, but adding in a little magical moment is what we all hope to do in design. I think Tinder nailed it. Okay, so you've accepted users can't tell you what they want. You've worked hard on your organization to have these 5 core, you know, skill competencies. And then, you know, you take the data and you put it into frameworks, and you guys have seen these frameworks before. I'm just going to do 3 real quick. The fundamental framework is this notion of moving from the concrete to the abstract, and from the here to the future, from today on the left side, that label got lost. and to the future on the right side of the horizontal axis. So you can be in the concrete here, the abstract future, or the concrete future. And you're basically moving around that process. And the frameworks that you're deriving, concrete here is your observations from the field, observations, notes, videos, interview transcripts. You move up into the abstract and you start putting those frameworks these observations into some framework. The first one we always talk about is the empathy map. The fact that people say and do things in the world, but what you're really trying to get to is what they think and feel. So you make a little 2x2 of this, say, do, think, feel, and you translate things from the say and do category to the think and feel category using your own personal insight and intuition. Knowing that you may be wrong, this is where your point of view is not a hypothesis that's testable. It's simply a point of view. It's a user plus a need plus an insight. I think this is what they were, when they said this, I think this is what they were feeling. Let's go try to see if that's true by building a prototype that would work if that thought were, in fact, accurate. Powerful but simple framework. The hierarchy of needs, this is Maslow's idea. You know, there's a lot of work now that, you know, this isn't necessarily a hierarchy anymore, that people can have, you know, not have all of their safety and psychological needs met and yet still be working on self-actualization, even in the poorest communities, even in South Sudan, in refugee camps, where people don't have security and maybe even food and safety. People still make jewelry. People still write and sing songs. They still perform artistic activities that are sort of very human. So although it's not a hierarchy, it's just a good way of necessarily looking at things. If I've made observations in the safety and psychology area, but I have no observations in the love, belonging, esteem, or self-actualization, it gives me a framework to go back to the field to ask different questions. Or if I found, you know, 3 of the 5 things already, and I'm going to try to intuit the other 2, it gives me a framework for what's missing, and it drives the design team to make better insights. And then finally, this one that comes out of Dave Pitnaik's book on need finding. Dave is the founder of Jump Associates and also has written a bunch on need finding. Is another book called Wired to Care, which is a popular business book. And he also teaches at Stanford, or teaches our undergraduate need finding class. He's a great guy. They developed what they call the, you know, it's just a simple mnemonic, AEIOU system for breaking down observations. A lot of times people come back from the field and they got all these videos and stuff, but they don't really know what they mean. And this is a great way for kind of looking at a video, encoding certain actions, and then breaking those actions down into insights. Or the actual activities that you observed. Did the team have did the people you were looking at have a role to play? Were they just participants? How was the power of the team divided up around activities? What did you notice? Environments. Where were they doing what they were doing? Were they in a public space or private space? Was the space constrained or open? Were they able to move things around or not? Interactions. Were they interacting with people or machines? And were the interactions with people or machines, what was the friction in those interactions? How did the interactions occur? What objects were they interacting with? Because, you know, if you think about affordance is how objects tell us what to do. You know, a hammer's got a handle and a head, and you know exactly which, you know, no one ever picks it up by the head and tries to bang with the handle. You know, there's an old expression, the hammer shapes the hand. But it's this combination of hammer and hand that is the tool, and that's the object that we can understand. With digital objects, it's much more complex to understand what were the things people were using, touching, how were they working. But if you think about the simplicity of swiping your thumb left and right, you know, in an app for selection, you start to understand how critical the objects and interactions are. And then other users, who else was there? What were people doing? How were those people involved in either making the observable behavior easier or harder to do? And we find it, so a lot of times just looking at a video of a user doing something, even just 2 or 3 minutes of that video can take several hours to decode what was going on. Looking at, you know, activities, environments, interactions, objects, and users, and then to take that and put it into an empathy framework this is what they were doing. These are all the things we observed them doing in all these different modes. And then those translates to a mental model of what we think was happening in their brain. How were they imagining the interaction to occur? Why were they getting stuck at certain points and not others? It's a really simple but very powerful way of breaking down your observations. And we really do encourage video as a way of capturing not only the simple and observable stuff, but body language, emotional state. When someone's frowning when they're trying to do something or smiling when they're trying to do something, tells you a lot about what's the cognitive load that's going on in their brain. So we'll get to that point, and then we're going to talk about, how do you make this stuff actionable? And I've alluded to it about, 10 times now. You have to start with the assumption that the information that you can get about the future is very limited. You don't live in the future, so, there's not much you can do. And this is compounded by the expert problem and by the problem of users changing their needs. So as you think about this, let's say you've come back with lots of observations and lots of, and you've seen people using products and or services that are the things you're interested in redesigning. So you do have a pretty strong data set. You have a very nuanced set of data about what's going on, what's the cognitive model, where are the points of friction, where's the cognitive load, maybe higher than it should be, where are the points of delight. Oftentimes, if you want to unseat an incumbent and they're doing a great job of making something easy, Lyft, Uber, Tinder, Snapchat, these apps that make, instantaneous and ephemeral communication super easy to do. If you want to unseat them, if you want to out-innovate them, you're going to have to be even more delightful. It's not simply enough to remove pain points or to remove, cognitive discontinuities. You're going to have to out-delight them. So you've got all this information, and the only way we know to make it actionable is this process of prototyping and iteration. So I don't have a specific example to show you, but in the case of going all the way back to my example of, all right, I'm working for a company that makes wheelbarrows, and we want to be the most innovative company, and let's say we want to grow 10 times, our size. Well, we're not going to, I guess we could start selling the wheelbarrow we've got in new markets. We could go to China, we could go to India, we could go to other places. But that's a marketing solution. That's not, and that may be an innovation, but it's not the same thing as a product innovation. So if we really wanted to say, how do you take a wheelbarrow company and reframe it into a materials logistics company or a getting stuff moved around where you need it, when you need it company? And we started building simple prototypes like drone delivery. We could mock that up with a $100 drone from the toy store and, paper bricks, and we could fly around job sites and see what people thought about it. We could look at sort of what's really is going on. It's an information systems problem. The stuff that we need is being delivered to point to different places than where we need it. So could we design an information system that solves that problem? Could we design micro trucks that could, deliver stuff on site almost directly, which is kind of like what a forklift is, only maybe an autonomous forklift that the bricklayer could call from his smartphone like he calls an Uber. So, you've got this you create a how might we statement, which is based on your insight that it's not about wheelbarrows, it's about logistics. How might we, automate the delivery of materials directly where they're needed, or how might we provide an information system so that logistics on a job site are, massively improved, or how might we create on-call systems so that carpenters and bricklayers can summon materials where they want, when they want. So each of those how might we statements, provokes a whole series of possible prototypes, because you don't know if the idea is a good idea but it's got an interesting resonance. It seems to match up some of the data that you came back from the field with. When you take that, and I know it's a good how might we statement when I can think of 3 prototypes I want to build right away, and the prototypes are fast, they're inexpensive and low resolution, and I learned something. I mean, literally a $100 drone and paper bricks, and I can understand what the psychological and cultural, advantages and disadvantages of flying stuff around a job site is going to be. Maybe people will think it's so cool, it'll be the neatest idea. Maybe people will think it's so dangerous and so out of control that they would never do it. Or maybe carpenters and bricklayers are such conservative users that this kind of technology intervention they would consider way, way, way too abrupt. I often think about the introduction of Google Glass as an example of technology. It's actually pretty cool that was introduced and handled so poorly that it became an instantaneous disaster. And that was even amongst tech early adopters. So you make things actionable by building in the world.
Thank you, Bill. So thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. It's always interesting to hear about all the different ways that we can learn and engage with our customers and arrive at so many unexpected results. So, Bill, one of the questions that often comes up is around this question of failure and risk-taking. What is the role of risk-taking in generating ideas? How important is that, and how do people overcome that, fear of failure?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it comes up all the time. When we do the master class, I often pull people in advance about, what do you want to learn before you get there. And one of the things they talk about is, hey, my organization doesn't like to take a lot of risks. We're a very conservative organization. Failure, has a really high cost around here, and yet we still want to be innovative. What do we do? And I do a lot of tours of the D-School as well, and I'm talking to companies, and I say, they say, we want to be more innovative. And I go, great, what do you want to, what are you willing to change? And they say, nothing. And I go, well, that's going to be difficult. If you're trying to invent something that's never been done before, if you're trying to create a product or service or innovate, in an area like the wheelbarrow company, then do something that's never been done before. Look, venture capitalists who are supposed to be really smart invest in, 10 companies and only 9 of them succeed. 70% of new products introduced in the United States, by some measures, fail to ever, return, 70% do not return the investment made in the development of those products, over the next 2 or 3 years. So 70% of products are failing, and 90% of venture capitalist companies are failing. And yet the ones that succeed are so powerful, the Googles, the Apples, the Snapchats, the things, they're so powerful. There must be something about being comfortable with some level of failure. Now, our idea is that you fail really early in the process because that's when you can do the most learning. But if you have an organization that's not willing to take risks at all, then my only question is, I believe that you don't actually have a choice, that innovation is going to happen in your marketplace, whether you participate in or not. So your only choice is, do I want to participate in innovation and try to stay ahead of my competitors, or am I willing to, sort of stay in a defensive posture, defend my position, continue to extend my products, incrementally? But boy, if a Google or somebody else comes around and completely out-innovates me, I will be caught, flat-footed, and then probably see my markets and my margins decline. So, when these companies come, I say, well, you don't really have a choice. You either do the innovation, or one of my students is going to go out, and one of my 25 or 26-year-old students is going to go out and start a startup in Silicon Valley, out-innovate you in your space, and then you're going to be, then you're going to be faced with a declining market. So the correlation between the ability to take and manage risk appropriately, and to actually reward appropriate kinds of failures that are learning opportunities. When we see companies doing those things, they tend to out-innovate their competitors. So it's just something you're going to have to get used to managing. like you manage any other risk in an organization. And look, 90% of your portfolio of development activities will probably be, what we would call it Apple line extensions. They're simply the next notebook, the next iPad, the next phone. But every once in a while, you're going to be called upon because of market forces to come up with a completely new, completely, not in a straight line. This is something no one was predicting kind of product. And in order to do that, you have to be willing to fail. Remember, the iPhone team failed 3 times with Steve. Steve turned down their iPhone 3 times because they said it wasn't innovative enough. It wasn't good enough. And so, if they can do that, anybody can handle it. Because failing in front of Steve was not a pleasant experience.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember that big companies can also fail. We in fact had a question from one of the participants about, if a company such as Google can fail with Google Glass, what will the rest of us smaller and less successful people do? And I think what you might be saying is that this failure is part of the process, and you need to kind of learn to live with it and learn from it and benefit from it. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And just a quick comment on Google Glass. It's a classic example of actually a very poorly managed project and a very poorly executed thing. I don't think it represents, a great innovation on Google's part at all. It falls into the category of, we see lots of startups at Stanford, and, lots of people come looking for advice. And they come in and they're so excited about their product and they show it to you and it's something, it's so hard, it's so technical, it's so amazing. We solved this huge technical problem. And then my first question is, great, who needs it? What's this for? What problem does it solve? They said, no, you don't get it. The technology is so cool. The problem with Google Glass is it was all technology. They didn't understand, they didn't take into account the social and emotional issues of wearing something on your face. They didn't take into account the privacy issues of having an always-on camera that didn't give any signal to the non-participant that they were being photographed, and so it violated so many social and sort of privacy norms, and it occluded the face in a way that made the person look foolish. And so it's like all of these things were easily discoverable had they done some need finding, but it was what we call a technology push project, where they're just pushing technology into the world and hoping to find a, quote, market fit. That almost never works.
Interesting. That's helpful. Are there any specific traits or characteristics of people that you look for that could be more successful in performing design thinking activities, et cetera? Is there something that you recommend looking for or kind of developing as a person wanting to do more of that?
There is actually, and it's interesting. If you come to if you're an undergraduate in my program or a graduate student, we'll teach you the entire process from empathy through prototyping through manufacturing, production, business planning, everything. But of course, some people are really good at one or two of the things. Some people are really good at business planning, and some people are really good at understanding markets and how to distribute things very cleverly. But there's a class of people that are just really good at the design research part, the empathy observation part. They tend to have very high social IQ, so their social emotional, intelligence is very high. They tend to be incredibly good listeners, because mostly this is just about listening and observing. It's not so much about interviewing. It's interesting. People who are great news reporters, a friend of mine teaches journalism at the Emerson College in Boston, and he was a journalist for many years for the Boston Globe. And he says, good journalists are just nosy people. They're not good listeners. They just want to pry into other people's lives and find out what's going on and then write it up. That's the opposite of an empathetic listener. So I've noticed some of my students just have a natural tendency towards listening. They have a natural tendency, they have an open sort of gregariousness which invites people to talk to them. They're the kind of folks that if they were sitting on an airplane would talk to everybody, in their section at some point, but they're not overbearing. So the high social emotional intelligence, sort of probably an extrovert or open mindset, tend to be the best at the design research side. Now, that's all learnable, for sure, but some people just have it naturally.
Great. So I think we have just 3 more minutes. We'll have time for one more question. Before we take that, just a reminder to everybody that we are recording this webinar, and an email with the link to the recording will be sent to all of you. So last question, you described earlier that it might take a few hours to kind of get all the data and information from even a few minutes of video. Could that lead to over-analysis of the data that you're collecting, and how do you avoid that?
Well, one of the mindsets I mentioned in I think the third slide was a bias to action. So although you do out in the field, you collect all this video and data. And by the way, someone mentioned, does everybody go on the team? We typically go in twos because someone can do the interviewing while someone's taking notes or running cameras very, very discreetly, because you'd like the person talking doesn't want to have to be taking notes. But when you come back and three or 4 teams have all talked to different users, you need some time to collate that information and just sort of chunk through it and understand it. But as soon as you believe you have even a cursory understanding or beginning understanding of the users, form a how might we statement and build a prototype. Because your data set's going to be incomplete anyway, and you know that because as soon as you build a prototype, the users will I say change their needs, but what they really will do is they'll just evoke new responses now that they know there are other possibilities. So the bias to action would say, spend 70% of your time in the field either interviewing or trying prototypes, and 30% of your time on the analysis. And we actually measure our student teams, our master's teams. They have to tell me every week how much time they spend doing and how much time they spend talking. And if I don't see a 70-30 split, I push them back out into the field to do more field work, which can be building, the prototype building and testing is part of the empathy process, is where the back part of the process connects back again to the front part. Anyway, I think we're probably out of time.
Yeah.
Thanks to everybody for listening, and everybody hung in there through the whole time. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of your day. Thank you for spending your morning with us.
Logic and your deductive reasoning to make decisions. That's not a particularly useful way to think about doing innovation, because when you're doing innovation, you're moving into a future where nothing exists yet, where the things that you're trying to invent haven't been invented. And so there really isn't much to be skeptical or rational about. It's much more interesting and much more generative to be curious. So we start with curiosity, and then we typically reframe the problem. That block called define, I always call redefine, because typically we've been given the wrong problem to solve. A lot of problems are sort of, out there in the world, but the real problem is something kind of either deeper or at a more abstract level. We like radical collaboration across multiple teams. We like to be mindful of our process, because when you're in the middle of a converging part of the process where we're trying to bring things together, it's important to know that's not a good time for brainstorming. When you're in a divergent part of the process where you're looking for lots more ideas, that's when you want to reach out, collaborate, and brainstorm more. And then, of course, we have a bias to action because of this sort of problem we're going to talk about next, about why people can't tell you what they want. Since there's not a lot of data to be analyzed and there's not much that we can plan with, we just like to start by doing. So with that as sort of a background, I always say, with design thinking, we always say that we start.
So now I'd like to present our speaker today, Professor Bill Burnett. So Bill is an adjunct professor of mechanical engineering and the executive director of the design program at Stanford. He directs the undergraduate and graduate program in the design and teaches at the D School. He received his Bachelor's of Science and Master's of Science in Product Design at Stanford and has worked in startups and Fortune 500 companies, including 7 years at Apple, designing award-winning laptops, and a number of years in the toy industry, designing Star Wars action figures. He holds a number of mechanical and design patents and design awards. And in addition to his duties at Stanford, he's on the board of Voss, a socially responsible fashion startup, and advises several other startups companies. So with that, Bill, I'd like to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. we'll just get started here, and we try to create a little bit of a provocative title. Meet Finding an MKY, your customers can't tell you what they want. And from the looks of the number of participants we have here, I guess the title works. But it's really an interesting conversation, and I have this conversation a lot with people when they either are reading about design thinking or they've maybe been to one of our works. It's just a way of breaking it down so we can teach it. I like to use an analogy to golf. If I were going to try to teach you how to, if I was going to try to learn to play golf, I couldn't teach anyone because I'm a terrible golfer. But if I was going to learn to play golf, a teacher would probably break the golf swing down into a number of things, like how do I hold the club? What's the proper grip? How do you address the ball? How do you place the ball on a tee? How do you bring the club back? So each of these pieces would be described as a separate step. But of course, that's not what a golf swing is. A golf swing is a continuous, a beautiful continuous motion that results in the golf ball going where you want it to go. So remember that the process diagram is not the way the process actually unfolds when you do it. That's one of the reasons we like to talk about the mindsets of design thinking. The way in which, designers think, and the way in which, if you have a culture of creativity, your design team or your company would think. I always say you start with curiosity. We're trained as engineers, designers, people, if you're in marketing, finance, whatever the discipline you are in an organization, you're trained to think about the world sort of with a skeptical rationalism. You break problems down into, smaller and smaller steps. You rationalize them. You usually rely with the people, not the problem. I've been a consultant for, 25, 30 years. Because someone might come in and say, hey, we're a company and we make these certain products and we'd like to make new, more innovative versions of these products. And that's typically the wrong place to start. We go back out and say, well, that's interesting. Let's just start with who your users are, who your customers are, and go there. Because most problems are actually solutions masquerading as a problem. The new wheelbarrow project is the classic example. I was doing a project for a company that makes wheelbarrows. Actually, it's a slightly disguised project. They made another really, really common industrial product that you'll find on every job site. But we're going to say they made wheelbarrows. And they wanted us to do an innovative wheelbarrow. And so the problem, of course, with that framing of the problem is that the problem already is described as a solution. They want another wheelbarrow. They just want an innovative one. That might result in some, small product modifications. 2 wheels instead of 1, better handles, more ergonomic, design of the lifting process so that people don't hurt themselves. But at the end of the day, you're still going to end up with a slightly modified wheelbarrow. And so that's an example where the solution is not actually what the problem is. The problem that a wheelbarrow solves, if you step back a second, is that, there's workers all over the shops, the master class, which is coming up in June, or one of the other workshops we do. And they go, well, wait a minute, this design thinking thing, it's kind of pretty simple, isn't it? You just go out and ask customers what they want, and then you build it, and then they say that's it, and then you're done, right? And it really doesn't work that way. So to take a little bit of a step back to just make sure everybody's on the same page, design thinking is both a process and what we call a set of mindsets, a way of thinking or a culture that you create in your organizations. And this is the pretty common diagram. You see this all over the D-School website and our website and the design program. It's this notion that it's a kind of a 5-step process. You start with empathy, and you define or redefine the problem. Ideate just means have lots and lots of ideas, and then you prototype and test. Now, the thing about this diagram that's a little bit misleading is it looks like it's a pretty linear process, but in fact, it's not that at all. What happens is people design teams enter this process at various points. Maybe they have an idea already that they want to try with customers. Maybe they don't even know what their customers, who their customers are going to be if they're a brand new startup. But this is sort of the way we describe it. And the way I've always talked about these kinds of process diagrams is, remember, the diagram isn't the process.